Welcome to our September session of Tunnel Talk, and the focus today is going to be winter spinach production. And before we dive in, I just want to go over some upcoming events. So for this webinar series, we're going to be looking at water quality for greenhouse production, October 9th. I think water quality is definitely something that we overlook quite often, but it is the largest amendment that we typically add into that greenhouse or tunnel space on a regular basis. So it's definitely worth kind of thinking about water and thinking about getting it tested. And then we're just going to kind of go through, what sort of is workable ranges and workable numbers compared to what might cause you problems in the long run. November 6th, we're going to be looking at winter spinach production again, but we're going to be focusing on specifically nitrogen management in winter spinach, as well as integrating cover cropping systems with spinach as well. So that should be great. And then our final session of the year will take place December 11th. And this is going to be a bit more of a sharing space. So we're going to have a few farmers across Nova Scotia share something that they've maybe tried on farm last year or this year that was new to them, whether they liked it, whether they didn't, and just kind of try to spread some awareness that way. There's a lot of work happening on farm, and I think this is a great way to kind of at least start the conversation just to kind of see who's doing what, and you guys can kind of take it from there. We have our off-calf field day happening September 18th from 10 to 3. That's going to be in Cambridge, Nova Scotia. That's going to be less focused on protected production, but really focusing on the 3 pillars for the On-Farm Climate Action Fund program, which will be split nitrogen application, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. There's going to be a tunnel-focused tailgate meeting sort of following those same pillars and those same trying to push those same best management practices, September 25th from 10 to 12 at Vitalberry Farms. And last but not least, we are going to be hosting a series of nutrient management planning workshops through the month of December. So each workshop is going to be the same. It's just going to be tailored to who registers. So really trying to get information on what commodities you guys are growing in for each session and making sure that we have the appropriate specialist show up that day. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve Higgins. Oh my gosh, I had a little intro for you, and here you go.
I can introduce myself if that's easier.
She's gone. Yeah, if you're open to that, take it away.
Let me share my screen first. Let's see. All right. Do you see the right screen or the wrong screen, Talia?
The wrong screen.
Okay. Now it's the right one?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. So yes, my name is Genevieve Higgins. I'm an extension educator with the University of Massachusetts Vegetable Program. And we have been doing working with winter spinach in high tunnels for several years now. And yeah, very happy to be here. David, I see you're on live, and as far as I'm concerned, if you have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. And we will get started. I should say to start, I definitely I know about Massachusetts production in high tunnels, and you guys are a little bit north of us, obviously. And so there's obviously some differences in temperature and winter light and all of that stuff that I don't know the details about. I just want a disclaimer ahead of time about that. All right, but this is what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about kind of the range of production systems that we see here in the Northeast US for winter high tunnel production. And then we'll talk in some more detail about 3 farms that we did a case study project with a few years ago and look in more detail into their winter spinach production. Then I'll go over a few of the main disease and insect pests of winter spinach that we see most often. And then we'll wrap up with just some kind of overall recommendations for maximizing and improving winter spinach production in high tunnels. We'll start off with why would you want to grow winter spinach at all? We've found in the Northeast down here that the demand for fresh and local greens in the winter is just huge. And you can get good prices for it pre-pandemic, or in 2020, maybe mid-pandemic, folks were getting $9 per pound for wholesale, $14 per pound in retail. Things have gone up from there. And that income can be really important to farms in the wintertime when other income streams have slowed down or stopped altogether. It can be useful to have crops in the ground all winter long in terms of retaining employees, to be able to offer them work through the winter so that they don't have to go find other jobs and then maybe not come back in the spring. And then having leafy greens that customers love at somewhere like a farmer's market can certainly attract customers to your stand, and increase sales of other crops that aren't quite as visually appealing or exciting to folks, like radishes and potatoes and stuff like that. But there are certainly challenges with growing winter spinach. It can definitely be nice to have a break in the winter from the work and labor. And if you have crops in the ground that have to be managed and maintained, you don't get so much of a break. You need access to frost-free water, which can be a hurdle for some folks. And then depending on your production system, the winter spinach production can be fairly labor intensive. And so you want to make sure whatever system you're setting up, you're actually going to be making money and that it's worth it in the end. Okay, so I'll talk kind of generally about the range of production systems that we see here, at least in Massachusetts. And things range quite a bit from, on one end of the spectrum, here I can turn on my little pointer, very low input, low tech manual systems. At the very end of that spectrum, some folks are growing in like temporary caterpillar tunnels, seeding spinach into there and then putting the tunnels over the top. Lots of folks harvest by hand, either actually literally by hand, like in this picture, or with knives, but by hand. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are a few farms in the Northeast that are highly mechanized, highly specialized farms that might just be growing winter spinach, with many high tunnels, doing things with tractor mounted implements, and really going whole hog into it. Most folks fall somewhere in the middle where they might have 1 or 2 tunnels that they're growing summer crops in, tomatoes, peppers, things like that. And they're growing in the winter a wide range of crops in there, so spinach, lettuce, brassica greens, radishes, things like that. And often folks have tunnels that tractors can get into for cultivation, and that's what they're working with. Okay, so some specific practices that I can go into a little more detail on. The first being planting. Here in Massachusetts, at least, people aim for direct seeding before like early October. Any fall growth that you're going to get in the spinach is going to happen before we hit the Persephone period, which is when the hours of daylight in the day drop below 10 hours per day. Light is usually the limiting factor for growth in the winter. So as soon as that daylight really drops down, growth really slows. So you want to seed, in Massachusetts at least, by early October, so that you get a nice strong flush of growth, hopefully get a harvest before Thanksgiving, which is late November, because that's a busy market time. And then things will regrow slowly over the darkest part of the winter, and you'll get another big flush in early spring when the light increases again. Some folks do transplant seedlings. So in this picture here, this is a farm that transplants their spinach, and that'll give you a jump start. Well, on both sides, it'll let you keep your summer crops in your tunnel for as long as possible and get a jump start on that spinach production. It's definitely more costly in terms of production of the plugs, but again, it gives you that jump start, and some folks find that it's worth it. When folks are direct seeding, we recommend a rate of 70 seeds per square foot. That is a rate that comes from the really big scale, I don't mind Maria in the background here, the really large scale growers in California and Arizona in the US. And at that seeding rate, if you get good germination, it gives you a nice, solid, even row that you can clear cut, which is the way that we find most efficient for harvesting. And then folks use a range of tools for seeding. Lots of folks use like a walk behind Jane seeder, like this one pictured here. Some of the more specialized farms or bigger diversified farms have a tractor mounted seeder. Some folks use things like vacuum seeders. I don't think this one is a vacuum seeder, but some folks do. All right, so harvesting, there's also quite a range in harvesting practices. Lots of folks harvest by hand. Again, I just said this, but we tend to recommend folks clear cut spinach because it's much more time efficient. There are lots of varieties that after they've been clear cut, the regrowth will be quite nice even after several harvests. Even if you're nicking the growing point, the regrowth looks pretty good. And we've found that because the demand for greens in the winter is so high, customers tend not to mind a few snipped leaves here and there in that regrowth harvest. But some folks do harvest literally leaf by leaf, like in this picture here, which is certainly time consuming, but gives you a lot of control over the quality. And then going along the spectrum, some folks use like a walk behind harvester. This one is powered with a drill. This is fairly common on smaller diversified farms. And then again, those larger, more specialized farms might have a tractor mounted harvester that just drives along the bed and harvests as it goes. In terms of washing and packing, it's nice to have a warm indoor, or at least indoors, if not heated or insulated, place to wash greens. Some farms are definitely triple rinsing their greens with a sanitizer in the water. But other farms don't wash greens at all. It depends on what your customers will accept, where you're marketing things to, and how dirty the leaves are getting, I suppose, in your growing conditions. If you are washing your greens, you're going to want to make sure the leaves are as dry as possible before they're packaged up for sale, so that you don't get post-harvest rot in the bag. There's many different hand-powered spinners out there available. And then for larger scale operations, folks down here will convert washing machines into a spinner that these orange, I guess they come in different colors, but these tubs will fit into, baskets will fit into to spin out the greens. And the University of Vermont Ag Engineering folks have a great guide on how to convert a washing machine into a green spinner. And that's where this QR code leads to that guide. Okay, so that's what I have about just kind of generally the range of production systems. I'll go into some of the three specific farms that we did case studies on a few years ago now. So we'll go into some more detail. The first farm that I'll talk about is the most low tech, so kind of on the low mechanization end of the spectrum. All of the tunnel prep and the seeding and the harvesting was done either by hand or with walk behind tools. So I think this year he happened to have used like a walk behind rototiller with a BCS attachment to prep the beds, but other years he just prepped them by hand. This farm markets their spinach solely through a winter CSA add-on. So he has a winter CSA and customers could pay $50 more to get spinach with every share that they got. Again, these prices, this case study was done in 2020, so in the middle of the pandemic. And prices have definitely gone up for CSAs, wholesale, retail, everything since then. So this farm had very low production materials costs. He basically was just paying for the fertilizer and the seed. In addition to that, the owner of the farm, it was a pretty small scale operation. So the owner of the farm was doing most of the labor himself, which of course there is a cost to that. And you want to be thinking about that with your farm costs. If you get sick or injured and can't do the work, what would it cost to have someone else step in and do it? But it becomes more of a slightly hidden cost if you, the farm owner, are doing most of the labor yourself. This farm, they did direct seed the spinach using a walk behind, I think it was a Jane seeder. He was seeding slightly less densely than our recommended rate of 70 seeds per square foot. But you'll see the next farm that we'll talk about was transplanting their spinach, and it was certainly more dense the transplanted spinach. So this farm had very high, I should say, labor costs, primarily because he harvests his leaves one by one. The flip side of that high labor cost is that it allows him to really control the quality. You can't quite see in this picture, but they had quite high winter cutworm pressure in this tunnel, which is a pest I'll talk about in a little bit. And because he harvests leaf by leaf, he can throw away, you can see these rejected leaves on the ground that have some ragged holes in them. He can really control the quality and end up having quite a nice product at the end. The next farm is kind of middle of the road for mechanization. They're a slightly larger farm, but very diversified. They sell their spinach mostly through wholesale, but a little bit of retail. They're certified organic, and because of all that, they were getting a pretty good price per pound at about $10.25 per pound. Again, that I'm sure it's gone up for them now. The tunnel that they're growing in is a pretty large tunnel, and you can fit a tractor in there. And so the tunnel prep was all done with tractors that they use across many crops across the farm. One of the big differences, as I mentioned already with this farm, is that they transplant their spinach. So you can see this was maybe a few weeks after transplanting. The density is much, much lower than a direct seeded crop. They're transplanting plugs at about 6 inches apart and several seeds per plug. But they really wanted to maximize the time that their summer tomato crops are in the tunnel. So they take out those summer crops in early September, around now, and at the same time seed spinach in the propagation house. And then they're able to transplant into the tunnel in early October, and that sets them up to be harvesting by late November, which is their goal. Another big difference with this farm is that they were the only farm that we looked at that covers their spinach with row cover over the winter in the tunnel. Here in Massachusetts, at least, you don't need to cover your spinach. It'll survive hard frosts as long as you're not handling it while the leaves are frozen. But some people do use the row cover for some added heat to kind of push things along. This farm, you can see in the top picture here, half of the tunnel was spinach and the other half was lettuce. Lettuce is more sensitive to the cold and usually does need row cover down here. So that might have been why they were bothering with the row cover. But also it does push things along a little bit with the added heat. But with row cover, the two big downsides are, number one, it's an immense amount of labor to be putting it on and taking it off to harvest, but also to let things dry out. Because number two, it really increases the humidity under the cover and can really increase the incidence of foliar diseases like downy mildew and some other fungal diseases. And this farm did get downy mildew the year that we were visiting them. Downy mildew is, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but one of the most devastating diseases of spinach in the winter. And it likes that humid environment that row cover creates. But these folks said that they knew they were planting at relatively low densities. And I should say these guys go through and harvest with knives, but just harvesting the lower leaves of the plant and leaving the crown untouched. And they felt that with that extra labor of harvesting carefully, they felt like they could keep the fewer plants that they had alive and healthy for much longer. So it seemed to be working for them. We certainly don't recommend harvesting crops that have downy mildew because the disease can develop in the bag on the shelf and you don't want your customers to be disappointed. But these guys felt like they could do a good enough job sorting out affected leaves to get a good product in the end. Okay, so the last farm that we visited for this project was the most mechanized, most specialized, most automated. They were just growing winter greens, so a lot of spinach, but also a lot of brassica greens. Not sure, I can't remember if they grow lettuce also, but a lot of spinach. They market their crops mostly via wholesale. For spinach that year, they were getting about $9.75 per pound. They will seed all fall long, with kind of the end of that, the end of their seeding period hitting in mid-October. And as you can see in this top picture, the whole end wall of their tunnels, they have many tunnels, but it rolls up and opens up so you can get a tractor in there very easily, and all of their tunnel prep and bed prep, seeding, harvesting is done with tractor mounted implements. So that's like harrowing, bed prep. They get in and make beds and then flame the beds for stale seed bedding, to get rid of weeds. They seed with a tractor mounted seeder, and then they have this tractor drawn harvester. So they had very high equipment costs because they're so specialized and they have this this mechanization, but very low labor costs. So like to harvest an entire tunnel of spinach would take them a few hours with just two people, one person driving the tractor, one person at the back of the harvester, just making sure everything was running smoothly. This farm, we were expecting to be far and away the most profitable and the most productive. Unfortunately, they had really significant yield losses the year that we were working with them, due to cladosporium leaf spot, which is a fungal disease of spinach. And they lost about $10,000 in sales from tilling in their crop, just in this one tunnel. So we'll go through the case studies in a second, but it was a bummer. Okay, so this is a lot of numbers, but we'll go through things kind of one at a time briefly. This is the kind of information that we ended up with from the case studies that we did, or from the enterprise budgets that we did with those 3 farms. So to remind you, farm 1 was the least mechanized, doing things mostly by hand, selling stuff through the CSA. Farm 2 was kind of middle of the road. They transplanted their spinach and used row cover. Farm 3 was the highly specialized, highly mechanized farm that we just talked about. I am not an economist, and it turns out enterprise budgets are really detailed and tricky, especially on farms where equipment is being shared across many different crops. It is a lot of details. So there's some information up top here about the equipment and stuff like that. And in the end, the profit numbers that we ended up with did not take into account the production equipment or any post-harvest information. So take this all with a little grain of salt, but the numbers are interesting to compare. The equipment costs were not surprising. Obviously, the really low-tech farm had very low equipment costs because it was basically just his body. And the specialized mechanized farm had very expensive equipment that they were using in their production. The planting density was an interesting detail that had more of an effect than I initially anticipated. And mostly it was that like your planting density will affect what is possible for harvest. If you want to be clear cutting, it's going to make more sense to plant much more densely. If you want to be selecting leaf by leaf and leaving that crown uncut, you're going to want to plant less densely so that you can reach around each plant and really be more picky with your harvesting. And so in either direction, if you have a harvest method in mind that you want to go with, you should find a planting density that works for that harvest method. And also if you have a planting density that you want to hit, that might be informing your harvest method. The labor time and labor cost was also not surprising, with the more highly mechanized farm with very low labor costs and the more manual farm with the highest labor cost. The production materials cost, it was surprising to see the really big jump that the effect that transplanting had on the cost of production materials, because you're paying for those trays and the potting mix. And it has a serious effect with the two kind of other ends of the spectrum, with very manual and very mechanized farms being relatively similar for the production materials costs. The price per pound that folks were getting, we certainly didn't see the the high end of this range in this project. It's gone up since then, and just we don't know how high customers will pay for winter greens. And so it's worth just making sure that you're getting a good price per pound. This farm was selling slightly more retail, selling slightly more spinach through retail markets. So they had a nice high price per pound, which did help them out, I think. And then the kind of final numbers, we were definitely surprised that farm 3, which was the most specialized, it didn't end up being the most profitable because of those losses from the disease outbreak that they had. And of course, this may be obvious, but just the real take home there was that specialization can certainly lead to higher profitability, but it also comes with higher risk. And if you're putting all of your eggs in the basket of winter greens and you get a devastating disease, it'll hit you quite hard and can be really a bummer. So it ended up that farm 2, the kind of middle of the road farm, was the most profitable per square foot. And partially because they were getting a really nice price per pound, and also because of these guys, the farm 3 losses that they had. All right, that's what I have about those case studies. I have some information about some diseases and pests, and then some overall tips. So we'll start with some diseases. The first one I'll talk about is spinach downy mildew. This is, I think I've already said this 3 times, but it's one of the most devastating diseases of spinach in the winter. It is an oomycete pathogen, so it's a fungal-like organism. It's not a true fungus, but it behaves a lot like a fungus. It produces this fuzzy gray sporulation on the undersides of the leaves, and the top of the leaf corresponding to those spots will turn yellow. The lesions tend to be trapped by veins initially, but eventually the whole leaf will just go down. The disease is favored by cool, moist conditions, so we mostly see it in winter spinach. And if we see it in field spinach, it's in like early spring, late fall. The pathogen is host specific to spinach, so it doesn't affect any other crops. And it requires a living host to survive. So it's not totally clear how the pathogen survives from season to season. It's likely that it finds spinach green bridges and just survives that way. So it's in your tunnel, and then it's in your earliest spinach, or it's in a neighbor's earliest spinach, just like that. The pathogen can produce these long-lived, very resilient oospores that can be carried on seed or can be in the soil, but it's not very well understood what role those guys have in the season-to-season survival yet. There are many different strains of spinach downy mildew. They call them races. There's currently 19 numbered races, so 1 through 19. But then there's innumerable novel strains that don't match a certain numbered strain in its behavior. Yeah, there's tons and tons of those. And then different cultivars of spinach are susceptible to different races of the downy mildew. So in seed catalogs, they'll report resistance and it'll look like this: downy mildew with a bunch of numbers after it. Those numbers are the races that the cultivar is resistant to. So for example, this one has a gap at 12 and a gap at 14, and it's not resistant to 17, 18, 19. We at the University of Massachusetts, we've been doing winter spinach variety trials for several years, growing many different varieties in the high tunnel over the winter to try to identify varieties that perform well in New England winter production systems. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on those trials now, but the gist of it is that there's many varieties that perform well. Spinach is, it likes cold weather. It's a cool season crop. And if you're choosing a variety that's listed in the seed catalog as being for that winter production slot, you're going to have some good production. When you're choosing varieties, we recommend growing several cultivars every winter with as broad downy mildew resistance as possible. So ideally 1 through 19. But if you have, it can be hard to find 1 through 19 varieties. So if you have a variety that has a gap in it, like this one has at 12 and 14, look for another variety that doesn't share the same gaps. So that if you get downy mildew on your farm, the chances of having everything wiped out is fairly low, and hopefully something will survive. There are oomycete specific fungicides that can prevent downy mildew if they're applied before symptoms begin and if they're applied regularly. We don't see spinach downy mildew on every farm every year, or even on the same farms every year. It's very sporadic and not super clear why. So we don't generally recommend applying like broadly preventative fungicides. But theoretically fungicides could be applicable and recommended if like you get downy mildew in one tunnel and you have spinach in a second tunnel and there's no symptoms yet, it might be recommended to apply a fungicide. Talia said that a lot of the folks watching these sessions are organic growers, and so of the OMRI listed fungicides, copper would be the most effective. There's certainly issues with applying copper to a leafy green because folks, it's the edible portion of the crop that you're spraying, and often copper products will leave like a blue residue, and without rainfall to wash things off, it can be a little funky. But copper would be the most effective of the OMRI listed materials. The next disease that I wanted to talk about is cladosporium leaf spot. We've been seeing this without fail every winter on at least some farms down here. This is a fungal leaf spot. It forms these tan spots that are quite round on leaves. And eventually over time and with enough humidity, they'll develop this olive green sporulation. You can sort of see that starting on this dot, this spot here. Again, like with the downy mildew, the disease development is favored by cool, moist conditions. This disease is definitely seed-borne. It's pretty commonly found on spinach seed. And then once it's causing disease on the leaves, the spores are spread via wind and splashing water and workers moving through crops, etc. There is differences in spinach varieties in terms of resistance to cladosporium, but it's often not reported by seed producers or distributors. So it's something that we're working on hopefully this year to be looking at varietal resistance. The most common way that it arrives on farms is on seed. It'll start in one variety and then move to different varieties. You can treat seeds with either bleach or hot water at a specific temperature and time, etc., to eliminate the pathogen from the seed. The tricky part about that is scale. Often folks are seeding an entire tunnel into spinach, and that's a lot of seed to treat. It's just a lot, and then a lot to dry, and it can be tricky to scale that up. But it is effective and does kill the pathogen without harming the seed. There aren't many fungicides labeled for cladosporium. At least here in Massachusetts, you can apply fungicides if they're labeled for the crop. It doesn't necessarily need to be labeled for the pathogen, but often you want the pathogen to be on the label to have confidence that it's really going to be effective. So avoiding disease development, if at all possible, is ideal. The last disease I want to talk about is not a leaf spot, but damping off, which is common in many different crops, not just spinach. This is a disease that's caused by several soil-borne fungal and fungal-like organisms. So Pythium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and all of those are ubiquitous in most soils. They're very weak pathogens, so they'll only attack plants that are otherwise struggling. So young plants, slow-growing plants, plants that have been weakened by something else. Maybe they don't have enough nutrients from the soil. And the pathogens love cool, wet conditions. So if soil got a little bit too wet, and that also contributes to slow plant growth, the pathogens can really take hold. Damping off can be classified as either pre or post-emergence stamping off. Pre-emergence stamping off is when the pathogens attack the seed before it's fully germinated and emerged. So it'll just result in poor stand and look like bad germination rate. Post-emergence stamping off looks like this picture down here at the bottom, where the seedling emerges and then is killed, often starting at the soil line by these pathogens. And you'll see the killed plants in that case. In the end, it just results in poor stand and reduced yields, and it can really take out some big chunks of folks' tunnel spinach. Doing whatever you can to just encourage vigorous growth in your crop will help get the plants past the point where they're really susceptible to these pathogens. So doing things like providing proper fertility, adequate water, but not too much water, preparing seed beds well, so that making sure you don't have compaction right below where you're seeding, making sure the bed is even and your irrigation isn't, pooling in certain areas. And then there's certain practices that can help improve soil health that will help suppress stamping off, namely cover cropping and soil steaming. And I can talk a little more in detail about those. Again, Talia mentioned we'll have another session talking about soil fertility for winter spinach production, and I'll talk a little bit more about cover cropping then. But in general, there is research that shows that incorporating cover crops into soil in high tunnels generally provides food for soil microbes across the board. In every soil, there are pathogenic microbes and beneficial microbes. And the concept is if you're providing food for those microbes, the beneficial microbes can often outcompete soil-borne pathogens, which can be fairly poor soil competitors. And of course, it's hard to find time to cover crop in a tunnel because usually it's very high value crops going in there and time is tight. But you might get to a point where you just say it's worth it. We're gonna forego the summer crop and we're gonna put cover crop in. This is a picture of a oats and peas cover crop over a summer on a farm. Or if you can't quite stomach missing out on a whole season's worth of a summer crop, if you cut your summer crop a little bit short, usually you can fit in like a quick buckwheat cover crop between your summer and winter crops. The other practice I wanted to mention is soil steaming, which folks are definitely getting more interested in down here. This involves heating the top few inches of soil to a high temperature, and the temperature itself kills soil pathogens, can kill aphids, mites, seeds of many weed species can be killed. The temperatures should kill nematodes wherever it reaches that high temperature. So it's quite, I can tell you a bit about the process. You can see in this picture, there's a tarp laid down. You have to do it kind of in these strips as wide as the tarps that come with the system. And then folks will use chains. You can barely see some here. Chains laid down all along the perimeter of the tarp to create a seal. And then it's a big propane steamer, basically, and steam gets pumped in through these pipes under the tarp where it's sealed. And so the steam and heat builds up under there. You have monitors under there to be monitoring the temperature for a certain amount of time. And then you roll it all up and move to the next bed and do it again. It's quite labor intensive. It's quite expensive with both the fuel and the labor that it takes to move the tarps around and everything. But it's providing, it's a management option for cases where folks feel they don't have many other management options. So I mentioned nematodes, which can be quite devastating in a high tunnel that you can't move. And also for soil-borne pathogens. And it's been, and so this picture, I think this is Becky herself. Becky Madden is an extension educator with the University of Vermont Extension. And she also has a farm, and she's done some trials on her own farm, looking, I think, specifically at weed management with soil steaming. So these pictures are from her. And you can see this unsteamed spinach with just like a lawn of chickweed and lamb's quarters. And this would obviously be very hard to harvest, hard to warrant keeping going and putting more labor into, versus some spinach that was steamed to 140 degrees and is virtually weed-free. So it is showing some promise. There hasn't been a ton of research looking at the effects, but it's showing some promise for folks. Okay, moving on to a few insect pests, and then we'll wrap up with some overall tips. Okay, so the first one, I mentioned this earlier, is winter cutworms. We see this definitely without fail every year. They are fairly easy to identify. They come in a wide range of colors, from this like light green to dark colored, but they always have this running line of dashes, 2 lines along the length of their body. They'll usually curl up into a little like C shape, like this guy, when you find them. But they're a little mysterious. They feed on the foliage at night, creating these ragged feeding holes. But they hide during the day, so they'll burrow into the soil a little bit or hide under a leaf. So you'll just wake up and you'll see these holes without finding any caterpillars. A good way to definitively diagnose that you have cutworms is to go out to your tunnel at night with a headlamp, if it's nearby where you'll be sleeping, and you'll see them out on the leaves. BT products and Entrust are both effective against them. They're most effective when the caterpillars are small. Both BT products and Entrust have to be consumed in order to be effective, and the small caterpillars, something like this size, just has to eat much less foliage in order to get a lethal dose than a big guy like this. But we've heard other successes. Not everyone wants to spray, so just hand picking out the caterpillars during harvest if you find them, or as I said, going out at night with a headlamp. They're easier to find because they're out on the foliage, and you can spend a few nights picking caterpillars. Fun times, and hopefully get some control. Another pest that folks struggle with in winter spinach is aphids. They get down into the growing points where they can hide and just proliferate. Biocontrol is always a nice option for dealing with aphids. The trouble with winter growing is that the temperatures are getting so low that a lot of the biocontrols aren't active at those temperatures. They'll go into diapause or just won't be active. Lady beetles will be active through the winter. And it's nice in a high tunnel. They tend to be effective because things are all closed in and they won't leave. It's a little tricky because they need high populations to sustain them. And usually we recommend, if you're going to implement some kind of control for aphids, you want to do it when the populations are still low, to kind of nip it in the bud before they get out of control. But if there aren't enough aphids to sustain the lady beetles that you're releasing, they'll leave the tunnel if they can, or they'll die, or go to sleep or something. So it can be tricky, but it's one of the best options. It can be easier in some cases. We think that the aphids are holding over from summer crops. So you want to make sure you're controlling aphids as well as possible in your summer crops. Often the options for control are, you have more options in the summer, both because in the winter, if you're growing winter spinach, I mentioned this earlier, that the leaves are the edible portion of the crop, and so it can be tricky to spray things on them because of the residues. But in the summer, it can be easier to control things in like a tomato, where you're mostly spraying the foliage and you're not eating the foliage. If you do plan to spray for aphids, using aphid-specific materials is ideal, so that you can preserve their many natural enemies. And the most effective unrealistic controls are things like insecticidal soap, horticultural oils, which either smother the aphids or mess with their cuticle. Azadirachtin products, there's many different brand names of azadirachtin, is a insect growth regulator, so it'll prevent them from molting and growing. But again, especially with the insecticidal soap and horticultural oils, you're spraying them on the leaves that they're gonna eat. It's kind of goopy. It's not always the best option, unfortunately. Okay, the last insect, well, not technically, oh, yeah, anyways, the last insect pest I want to talk about is crown mites. These are tiny mites. They're hard to see without magnification, but they feed in the growing point of the spinach, and they cause this kind of wrinkly, deformed growth. They cause the most damage in the middle of the winter when the plants are not really growing or growing very, very slowly. And they're more common and more damaging in soils that have high organic matter levels. These ones are really tricky to manage. It's always a bummer to just say, if you get them, till in your crop. But there hasn't been much research on effective pesticides. For organic materials, anything that's going to smother them, similarly to the aphids, the soaps and the oils, they should be effective, but it's tricky to get good coverage down deep into the growing point where they like to hide. So this would be one to reach out to your ag support staff about if you suspect it, to get some help managing them. Okay, that was pests. And now I've got just kind of an overview slide about just some tips for maximizing production. Things that we've found, kind of like the easiest ways to improve profitability in winter spinach. The first thing I'll say is to just plant more densely. If you're planting well below that 70 seeds per square foot target that we recommend, just bumping up your density can help increase your yields. Harvesting by clear cutting, we also recommend. It's obviously the most time efficient, and it's a bit of a judgment call about what quality you want for your spinach. This is an example I mentioned, the difference between varieties in terms of how well they regrow after they've been clear cut. Responder on the left here, both of these varieties in these pictures have been harvested twice already, so they've been cut to the crown 2 times, and responder just looks much cleaner. There's much fewer cut leaves. The leaves that did get nicked look relatively fine, versus bandicoot gets real raggedy and looks much worse. So there's definitely differences between varieties in terms of how they respond to clear cutting. But if you can find a variety that works well for that, it definitely is the most time efficient. You want to make sure that you're getting a good price, and compare to folks that are selling around you. We don't seem to have found the limit for what customers, at least in retail or farmers markets, the limit to what folks will pay per pound for winter greens, local winter greens. Increasing harvest size. Some of the farms that we worked with on the spinach project in 2020 were harvesting like baby leaf spinach leaves, quite small. And we found that just bumping up that harvest size slightly just obviously increases your yield, just because the plants are slightly bigger. And it was a nice simple way to increase yields. In Massachusetts, at least, that's the big disclaimer, where I know it's colder, colder for longer up there. But row cover is not required to keep the spinach alive. It can push things along if that's going to work for your timing, but it adds a lot of labor and creates some negative growing conditions also for disease control. So think about that before you start using row cover. The recommendation for managing downy mildew is to grow multiple downy mildew resistant varieties, looking for varieties that have resistance to those newer strains like 17, 18, 19 of downy mildew. You want to take the time to be preparing uniform beds and making sure that your irrigation is being applied uniformly. Diseases can often start in areas where irrigation is dripping, or in beds that have low points or are tilted. Or compacted in certain ways. So that we have found is well worth the time and effort. Fertility, I know we have another session coming up soon talking only about fertility, so I won't say much about it now. Our recommended fertility rates are down here. We recommend applying fertilizer up front. Sometimes based on a soil test, it's not required. There's enough leftover nutrients from a summer crop. So it's worth taking a soil test in between. But then we also recommend taking a pre-sidedress nitrate test to test the soil nitrate levels in like late February when that Persephone period is ending. So daylight is increasing again and the plants are really starting to take off again. We have noticed a pattern of seeing lots of yellowing spinach once those plants start to take off again. And they can often benefit from a little nitrogen added at that point. And our recommendation is to add side dress with nitrogen if the nitrate is below 30 parts per million. And that's like the classic, it's early March and spinach looks like this, and it's real hard to pick out those yellowing leaves. Okay, and that is what I've got. I'm happy to take any questions, or my contact info is here. Anyone is welcome to reach out at any time if anyone has any spinach questions.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, so that was it was good work. So yes, we do have a question here. What seeding depth do you recommend?
That's a good question, and I don't know that off the top of my head. When we do our spinach trials, we see probably less than an inch down. I don't know for like the case study farms, I don't know specifically how deep they were going. Off the cuff, I would say you don't want to, if you have the ability to keep the soil moist, seeding relatively shallowly so that those seeds can germinate and emerge pretty quickly would seem ideal.
Yep. And do you find that Savoy or smooth leaf cultivars are more productive and winter hardy?
It is dealer's choice. I think it's really just cosmetic and what folks like. I've heard people say they like really Savoy leaves because it adds more kind of volume in the bag and like looks more substantial and helps prevent the leaves from kind of sticking together. But there's no pattern in terms of winter hardiness. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you've kind of got some champions and maybe some less successful options in both those groups. So there is a question about recommended nitrogen fertility inputs. I think that's going to be some of the ground that we're covering in the webinar in a few weeks. I don't know if you have something kind of off the top of your head.
Would also say, to wait for the next one. We recommend putting down 20 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the fall. But any form should do. I think next week, Judson Reed will talk, or not next week, at the next spinach session. I'm not sure if they've looked at different forms of nitrogen. With the cold temperatures, with organic forms of nitrogen that are slower to release, those are depending on soil microbes to be, doing their processes to get the nitrogen into a form that the plants can use. And as temperatures drop and soil temperatures drop, those conversions would certainly slow down. So choosing a faster, an N source that's available more quickly would probably be a good idea. But I'm sure there's a range of good options, and I'm also sure that Judson Reed will have more details to share about that.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to kind of see what he, kind of the work they've been working on, and we can kind of refine that practice a little bit better.
Definitely.
Do you find that watering on sunny days in the winter can help with aphid or crown mites?
In general, watering on sunny days is a good idea. Not just for like foliar disease implications. You want to water like in the morning on a sunny day when the leaves are going to dry out as fast as possible, so that the leaves aren't sitting there wet and helping spores germinate. I wouldn't imagine that watering alone would deal completely with an aphid or crown mite infestation. Sometimes like a really strong irrigation or like in the field, a really strong rain event can wash aphids off of leaves and then they don't move very far. But I would imagine if you have a big aphid or crown mite outbreak, I don't think watering alone will handle it, unfortunately. That would be
Yeah.
good.
And I'm kind of curious, just kind of before we jump to this next question, like you talked a little bit about the use of low tunnels and where it's not necessarily something that you guys need or need to recommend. Do you find that there is like higher incidences of disease pressure or insect pressure in sort of a low tunnel in a tunnel? Or is it kind of scattered across the board?
You mean compared a low tunnel compared to a high tunnel, or you mean like a crop in a high tunnel that has hoops and like row cover?
This
The
one,
second one,
yes.
I would
Yes.
imagine that it would be easier for pests to take off more
Yeah.
quickly under row cover.
Yeah.
They're just like not under there checking things as often, and the bugs like a slightly warmer environment also.
Yeah.
And then the humidity, the added humidity for diseases. Um, the nice thing about like not permanent like caterpillar tunnels or low tunnels out in the field is that you can move them compared to most high tunnels. Some people have the awesome setups of like rolling high tunnels that can move from
Yeah.
spot to spot. But yeah, one of the big downsides of high tunnels is that, yeah, they're in one spot and there's only so many crops you can grow in there that will make you money.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to be able to rotate away from your pests, for sure.
Do you think that there are advantages to spray a biological fungicide for a preemptive strike against mildew?
It definitely might be advantageous. Certainly if you're using biological fungicides, the time to use them is, or you need to use them preventively.
Mhm.
They usually don't have efficacy after a disease has taken hold. I, off the top of my head, don't know specific research about like
Yeah.
which ones are effective or not. Um, and then it's also a numbers game of like the time and cost of materials, spraying. Um, but so it might hurt in terms of economics. It wouldn't hurt in terms of like efficacy, to be spraying them preventatively, I would say.
And I was curious about the BT product that you were talking about as well. Like, is that something that should be a preventative because it is sort of efficacious after feeding, or
So I would, if you're in the tunnel and I guess I wouldn't necessarily spray BT preventatively because of the time and material costs. I would, but I would like be scouting. I would recommend
yes.
scouting a spinach crop so that you would notice when there were small feeding holes and you could catch it when the caterpillars were small. Because BT will hang out on the leaves for some time, like it's not going to be degraded by sunlight like immediately, like some other pesticides. But it won't last forever. So if you're spraying it and hoping that it's going to be there for weeks when some eggs hatch, it probably won't be effective
Yeah.
after that. No use wasting your time and money.
No, that one's a bit tricky, I find.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah,
there definitely a sweet spot.
yeah, 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 yeah. And it's,
Yeah.
yeah, with the BT, we have heard some anecdotes from folks that something about, everything is just like slower in the winter and
Yeah.
including insects metabolisms, and probably how fast they're eating. So it doesn't seem to work like as fast as well as BT like in brassicas in the summer. But if you can catch it early, it does seem to be effective.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure why.
Um, and just kind of one last question. You talked about the soil steaming. Is that something that you're seeing more people get into in terms of, disease management?
Yeah, it definitely, there's a few locations, I think in Vermont and maybe in Massachusetts that have soil steamers like available to rent through the like county conservation district.
Oh, cool. Yep.
So in those locations, like there's little hot spots where, no pun intended for steaming, but where people are like getting into it. I know a few farms that have bought like really big scale ones for their own farms, but that's like, they're pretty intensive high tunnel growers. And yeah, I feel like there's not another option. Yeah,
Yeah,
but definitely
absolutely.
increased interest in it for sure, especially for the weed control also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are, and maybe like, I'm not sure if you have this number off the top of your head, but is there like, do we do it once every 3 years, every 5 years? Like, how frequently do we kind of need to
I don't know the
retreat?
difference between like 3 and 5, but it's definitely not like an every year thing for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh, and I mean, it depends on like also just like scale, like what size of a steamer do you have access to, and how many tunnels do you have? Like you can only do
So
so
much.
much in a day when you're like also producing summer crops,
Yeah.
because it is very labor intensive. So yeah, it would be like yeah, maybe every 3 years minimum.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're playing
but it's
around
yeah,
a bit with ASD
yeah, it feels
this
like
year, which is kind of cool.
a similar vibe, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's
So it's
new.
kind
It
of
is new, and like it does. I've heard from one farm that um that went like really hard into the soil steaming, and then was definitely like having some weird nutrient stuff the following
oh,
winter, because it's like you're
interesting.
messing with all the microbes. It's killing basically all the microbes, and the beneficial ones will come back, especially if you can cover crop and all the good stuff. But just things get kind of wonky, and it's a
Yeah.
new, I guess I think that, yeah, we're still seeing what it does.
Well, it's a hard pill to swallow because we are really trying, we're talking a lot about soil health and beneficial
Totally.
microbes and we're really, really pushing that as, something that's going to work for us. So then just to kind of
Kill it all. Yeah.
clear cut that is like really hard.
Right. It feels like
Yeah.
a step up from like soil fumigation though, where you're not like
Yeah.
with
Right.
really toxic chemicals.
The
But
lesser of the evils for sure.
I
Awesome.
see David's note that you've had some success with Scorpio and winter cutworms. That's great to hear.
Mhm.
Cool.
Awesome.
Cool.
So yeah, I think that's probably it for today. Yeah,
Great.
if anyone has any questions, you can always reach out to myself. And you will also be back in November for our session there, where we can talk a little bit more intensively about cover cropping and fertility. So that'll be awesome.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Thank you so
thanks so
much.
much for your time today.
Yeah, have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye.